Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra, verse 85, YUKTI, number 61. We'll go right into the verse. Līnaṃ mūrdhni viyat sarvaṃ, bhairavatvena bhāvayet, sarvaṃ bhairavākāra-tejas-tattvaṃ samāviśet. Contemplate the entire sky dissolved in your head as the awe-inspiring expanse of consciousness. Bhairava. You will become completely immersed in the reality of the radiant energy that is Bhairava's nature. Well, this would seem to be quite a mysterious verse and an interesting one, okay? Really, there's no better way to explain what this verse is talking about than to quote from the very fascinating British awakened guy named Douglas Harding, who's no longer in the body, but he wrote a book called On Having No Head. Now, what's important about Douglas Harding is he didn't study this verse. He didn't study Dzogchen or Shaivism or Tantra or non-dualism. He had this experience spontaneously. I mean, he was a spiritual seeker before this, but he had no access to these teachings that you guys are receiving, and certainly had never heard of a teaching like that in this verse. And he was hiking, this is, half a century ago, he was hiking in the mountains of India, the Himalaya mountains, and he had this extraordinary spontaneous realization. And again, it's not like sudden enlightenment, like out of the blue with no prior practice. No, he had been a seeker, he had been a meditator, and none of it had worked. And then, having to some extent let it go and just hiking in the mountains, seeking nothing, he had this realization. And I'll read his account to you. And Douglas Harding has a bit of a renaissance these days, partially due to Sam Harris promoting his teachings. I actually knew about Douglas Harding well before I heard of Sam Harris, so I'm not just jumping on the Sam Harris bandwagon here. Apparently my ego wants to reassure you of that. But yeah, I did discover Harding quite some time ago, and this is the key passage of his account, which is also found in Sam Harris's book, Waking Up. What actually happened was something absurdly simple and unspectacular. All at once, I stopped thinking. A peculiar quiet, an odd kind of alert limpness or numbness came over me. Reason and imagination and all mental chatter died down. For once, words really failed me. Past and future dropped away. I forgot who and what I was. My name, manhood, animalhood, all that can be called mine. It was as if I had been born that instant, brand new, mindless, innocent of all memories. There existed only the now, that present moment, and what was clearly given in it. To look was enough. And what I found when I looked was khaki trouser legs terminating downwards in a pair of brown shoes. Khaki sleeves terminating sideways in a pair of pink hands. And a khaki shirt front terminating upwards in absolutely nothing whatsoever. Certainly not in a head. It took me no time at all to notice that this nothing, this hole where a head should have been, was no ordinary vacancy. On the contrary, it was very much occupied. It was a vast emptiness, vastly filled. A nothing that found room for everything. Room for grass, trees, shadowy distant hills, and far above them, snow peaks, like a row of angular clouds riding the blue sky. I had lost a head and gained a world. Here it was, this superb scene, brightly shining in the clear air, alone and unsupported, mysteriously suspended in the void. And this was the real miracle, the wonder and delight, utterly free of me, unstained by any observer. Its total presence was my total absence. Lighter than air, clearer than glass, altogether released from myself. I was nowhere around. There arose no questions, no reference beyond the experience itself, but only peace and a quiet joy, and the sensation of having dropped an intolerable burden. I had been blind to the one thing that is always present, and without which I am blind indeed, to this marvelous substitute for a head, this unbounded clarity, this luminous and absolutely pure void, which nevertheless is, rather than contains, all things. For however carefully I attend, I fail to find here even so much as a blank screen on which these mountains and sun and sky are projected, or a clear mirror in which they are reflected, or a transparent lens or aperture through which they are viewed, still less a soul or a mind to which they are presented, or a viewer, however shadowy, who is distinguishable from the view. Nothing whatever intervenes. Not even that baffling and elusive obstacle called distance. The huge blue sky, the pink-edged whiteness of the snows, the sparkling green of the grass. How can these be remote when there's nothing to be remote from? The headless void refuses all definition and location. It is not round or small or big, or even here, as distinct from there. So, an extraordinary passage. Douglas Harding, from his book On Having No Head, as quoted in Sam Harris's book, Waking Up. I actually lost my copy of Harding's book some years ago. Okay, so what I want to draw your attention to is, notice there are specific phrases here, specific words and phrases that could be exact translations of Sanskrit phrases from the Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra. It's so extraordinary, right? A vast emptiness, vastly filled. Unsupported, niradhara. We find this word over and over in the Vijñāna-bhairava, meaning requiring no support, no substratum, which he explains later in the passage. Unstained, vimala. We had that word in the previous verse. Luminous and absolutely pure void. So again, my point here is that this is an independent verification of this way of perceiving reality, because again, he's not translating Sanskrit terms. That's not what's happening here. He did not read this text or the others like it, or get initiated by a Dzogchen master or a Trika Shaiva master. That's, of course, not the central thing, right? Sort of this idea of independent verification. That's not the central thing. The central thing is that anyone can have this experience, which, again, when it really happens, it's not an experience, it's what I would call a perspectival shift. It's like, in all these kind of wonderful examples of sort of optical images that can be seen two or more different ways, like, the simplest and most famous being a vase or a vase that if you shift your perspective, oh, it's two faces in silhouette, right? Or in profile and silhouette. Oh, I can see it as a vase, I can see it as two faces, right? Or the famous drawing that can be an old crone's face, or it could be a young woman turning away, right? That you can see it as one or the other. You can flip back and forth, but until you see it as both, you only see it as one. You don't suspect that the other is there. And then you're like, oh, it's an old crone or whatever. And somebody says, no, it's a beautiful young woman with this feather turning away. Wait, I don't see that. No, look here. And then, oh, now I see it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? You can flip back and forth, old crone, young woman, but you can't forget that there's this other way of seeing it, right? Once the perspectival shift happens, it happens. So this is what we're talking about. This is so important, you guys, to distinguish from a mystical experience or a peak experience. It's a perspectival shift that, when it's real, remains available to you forever. Now, having said that, of course, if you're freaking out, if something stressful is happening in your life, sometimes you need to take some time to calm your system, settle your system, settle your nerves, one might say, before that different perspective is available to you. But it's always available. Again, sometimes you just have to sort of calm yourself down for a few minutes before you can access it. But if you've had the perspectival shift, it's always available. Now, it's also possible that you have an experience that isn't a perspectival shift, and because it's not always available after that, right? Even if you calm down, or settle your system, you still may, if you can't shift into the perception that everything is internal to consciousness, then you haven't had that perspectival shift yet. So the experience, curiously, and I think there's not yet any explanation for this, at least not any neuroscientific explanation for this yet. You can have the experience with or without the perspectival shift. So you can spontaneously experience oneness, right? Unity consciousness. And it may or may not come with this perspectival shift where you actually see that everything is internal to consciousness, and that consciousness is what you are. So therefore everything is internal to you, to what you are. There's no outside, there's only inside, and everything is inside with you because it's all consciousness. And of course, this is not solipsism. It's not all your consciousness as opposed to somebody else's. It's all consciousness, and consciousness is trans-individual, right? It's not personal. It's not yours. So that's why this is not solipsism, for those who know that term. Okay, so back to the verse. Now that we've had the orientation through Douglas Harding's account. Now we can see how this verse, I think I'm not stretching the verse. I think I'm not making the verse fit Douglas Harding's account. I think it does fit. Now I'll show you why. And of course, I could be wrong. If we could conjure the original author of the text, he or she might go, that's not quite what I meant. But contemplating this, for many years, this is what I see, and you are welcome to have, of course, your own perspective. But looking at the verse again, it says, one should contemplate, bhāvayet, the whole sky, viyat here, which usually means just sky, the whole sky as dissolved in one's own head, meaning to say that the sky is continuous with and has the same nature as one's head, right? It's this moment that I would argue, it's this moment that Harding had, looking down. You can do it right now. You look down at your own body and you track upwards with your gaze, up, 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 your own body, all the way up, and what's sitting on top of your body is a world of experience, a universe, right? And yes, of course, you have sensations of having a head, but that's part of the universe of experience that sits atop your body, as it were, Look, this is not about, some kind of rational idea, right? This is just an entry point into perceiving the nature of reality. This thing that Harding says, I've got a body with a universe where its head ought to be. So it either works or it doesn't. You have the perspective or you don't, and you might have it later, spontaneously. There's no telling and there's no forcing it. But then the verse says that you realize that this total openness, viyat sarvaṃ, that is dissolved in one's head has the nature of bhairava, which is again expanded and intensified awareness. Okay. Vivid, real, raw, direct, immediate. That's what that's what intensified is referring to. And then the verse says that you fully enter into, you fully become immersed in and permeated by the reality of the radiant energy that is the nature of bhairava, of this expanded consciousness. Tejas, radiant energy, right? In Harding's account, he called it luminous, pure void, right? Yes, luminous and absolutely pure void. Luminous, right? That's the point there, is that it's not emptiness like in an empty box, this void. It's luminous. It's radiant with the totality of that which fills it, and yet somehow being filled with all these phenomena does not impinge upon it. This is the part that the mind doesn't get. You have the direct experience and it makes perfect sense. That all the phenomena that fill this void or space or openness or emptiness don't fill it. They fill it, but they don't fill it. They don't impinge upon it, right? It's still infinitely vast and open and uncluttered, even as it's full of phenomena, at least on from a planet Earth perspective. Okay, hope that makes sense. So, again, this, of course, as you've noticed, happens with some verses. I make an argument of what I think is going on here, what I think the verse means, and it's not the only possible conclusion, but those of you who are in the Facebook group, you can look at the alternate translations, right? Every time I post a VBT verse, I post 4 or more other translations by other folks, that's to support you in your own contemplation, right? Because it's not like you just take my word for it, you know. Of course, I think my translation is the best. If one doesn't think that, one shouldn't be in the business of translating, right? But you can look at the other translations, several of which are by, you know, very good Sanskritists, and come to your own conclusion if you like. But, you know, Harding's account deserves your contemplation, even if you personally decide to reject it as the meaning of the verse. Anyway, I don't mind. It's all part of the process. For me, it is a profound and accurate elaboration of the meaning of this particular verse. So that's it for this week. These two yuktis, 60 and 61. Warm thank yous and deep gratitude to all the patrons on Patreon, without whom this free course, this free 2-year-long in-depth course on the VBT would not be possible. As I've mentioned before, it is actually the most in-depth course on the text ever offered in the English language. Not saying it's the best ever. Maybe someone will do a better one. But so far, it's the most detailed and thorough explanation. And that's made possible by you patrons on Patreon, 187 of you. So thankful. Okay. Om.